guys, welcome to chapter 1 of Burnish. Burnish is my debut novel. It came out in December of last year, and it follows 5 different characters, 5 different mythical creatures in their short stories. Each, so I wanted to introduce those characters to you by reading you the first 5 chapters of Burnish, starting with Heart today. So if you like this little reading, please feel free to check out Burnish. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, share, do the YouTube things. Check out the Patreon if you're interested. Lots of cool stuff happening over there and some awesome tiers for you to support me and my channel further. I hope you enjoy Burnish. Heart never spoke. She only screamed. She had begged for mercy before, silently and wordlessly, but never had she succeeded. Her captors were unforgiving and unyielding creatures. Heart learned long ago that she had to submit to them if she wanted to live. The hanging lantern swayed as the wain came to a stop, and Skeltos stood, the floor creaking under his weight. His horns scraped the low roof, thick bone against rough wood. He was a huge creature of muscle and fur, a man with a bull's legs and head, wearing a red loincloth and gripping a massive mace and chain. Up. Skeltos' voice rolled through Heart like deep thunder, and with it came a familiar terror that forced her to obey. Her weathered gray dress hung from her skeletal frame as she moved to her feet, her willowy black hair draping over her thin arms. Heart's hands were empty. Odalisk weren't sanctioned to possess belongings, and certainly not weapons. All she had was her voice, and Masmus had fashioned a leather maw to keep her silent until they needed her. She was powerless. The lanterns painted Skeltos in flickering light and shadow as she followed him to the door, her own footsteps a whisper compared to the harsh clopping of her captor's hooves. Skeltos took hold of the iron bar sealing the door and swung it upward with a forceful heave. A loud slam crashed through the cart. Heart flinched, but it was not the sound that scared her. It was what came after. The door's weight drew it forward, and, with a low groan, it slowly fell open. Beyond it was nothing but black. Her heart twisted. She knew night had already fallen. Her keepers had no need for her when the sun was out. There would never be light on the other side of that door. There was no reason to hope for it. Still, she always did. With a snort, the giant minotaur stepped down onto the grass, and the cart swayed and jerked. Heart stumbled, her breath shuddering over her leather restraint. Skeltos' hooves slammed into the ground. Run. Please, run. Heart pleaded wherever they went. Hopelessly, she begged townsfolk to wake up and save themselves while they still could. Wake up. They're coming. But they never heard her, because she couldn't speak. Skeltos swiped at Heart. His grip locked on the leather binding around her wrists. She flinched. He yanked her forward. She tried to protest, but her shouts were muffled, smothered. It took Skeltos no effort to drag her legs over the dirt-caked floor, and when her body reached the cart's edge, he dropped her. Heart threw her hands out to catch herself. Her palm slammed into the muddy ground. Pain cracked through her wrists. Masmus. Heart pushed herself to her feet, fighting against the fatigue pressing down on her. This familiar exhaustion found her each time Skeltos and Masmus brought her out, and each time she waited for it to consume her, for her body to give in to its relief. But it never did. The heavy door slammed behind her. Heartsick maiden. Anxiety twisted through her. Masmus's scratching, nasal voice made her sick, and hearing her true name only made it worse. She called herself Heart because she wanted to be good, because she wanted to have the courage that a heart had. But no matter what she wanted or what name she gave herself in her thoughts, Heart was still a banshee, an odalisk, contracted to serve monsters for the rest of her life. She turned to face Masmus. Though her fog was starting to descend on them, she could still see him. A half-man, half-demon brute, with deep red skin and a pelt loincloth, the Oni towered over her and the cart alike. He was armed with a giant iron club, massive teeth jutted out from around his mouth, and the 2 horns sprouting from his dark, feral hair were long and sharp. Heart couldn't look at them without remembering the bodies she'd seen them pierce. "Follow me," he said. Skeltos took the chain of his mace in one hand with a strong huff, and Heart's legs jolted forward. She knew the strike of their weapons, and she knew Masmus preferred his own ways of brutal punishment over his club. If she moved too slow, if she tried to resist, if she fought against them, they wouldn't hesitate to drive her into submission. She followed Masmus around the cart. The white cloud that her presence summoned was growing thicker, but she still caught sight of the unsuspecting town ahead. Beyond the low stone fence it was dark, not a candle or lantern to be seen. The cobblestone street was empty, and the small, modest cottages were decorated with ivies and flowers so beautiful, Heart wished she could take a few, if only to hold them and remember that good still lived in this world. But it would not be so. She was never allowed to cross the threshold of a town. From there, escape would be far too easy. Watching the town brought her a slow, lilting calm, one that shattered at the sound of Masmus ripping the cart's side door open. Inside hung 2 helmets of pure lead, witched by the master of Odalisk. Heart learned years ago that the powerful enchantress could stop the magic of any being that crossed her path, and she could bestow the same protection onto whatever item she desired. A witch told her that, in a desperate bid for her life. Heart could still hear her low, wavering words. "When they put those on, your scream doesn't touch them. But if they were unprotected, you could kill them, and then we could run." She couldn't recall the Odalisk's name. All Heart remembered was her envy, because even though the witch's voice shook with fear, she still spoke, and Heart could hear her. Metal clanged against horns as Skeltos and Masmus adorned the last of their armor. Back then, when Heart first learned that the helmets were charmed, she clung to the hope that one day her captors would be vulnerable. She told herself that then she could make her escape, but that was ere the witch disappeared, and ere Heart met the enchantress. She no longer hoped. With a grunt, Masmus swung the door closed. Heart's pulse pounded through every piece of her, but it was heaviest in her throat, where the silence lived, where the danger would soon claw. Masmus latched the door and started for the town without another look at her, and as she followed the Oni, Minotaur hooves battered the ground behind her. Thick, dark dread snaked through her bones. The townspeople were sleeping peacefully. They didn't know monsters lurked nearby. They didn't know their time was running out. Heart's fog surrounded them, growing thicker with every step, but it still didn't hide the town from view. She used to plead for it to make her blind and save her from the tragedy, but it was no use. It was always transparent. It always let her see. Masmus stopped right before the trees thinned, just short of the town's border. Heart took her place at his side. Skeltos fell in line next to her. She could hear their shifting grips, the readying of their weapons, but she dared not look. It wasn't wise for an Odalisk to show that they had any mind of their own. Something pressed into the back of her head. The lock clicked. The pressure around Heart's jaw and face lifted, and she did her best to keep her eyes trained on the town in front of her as Masmus pulled the leather from her face. Cool air brushed her newly exposed skin. This was the worst part. She wanted to move her mouth. She wanted to speak, or even just run her fingers over her lips. But she would be punished, so she stayed still. Statuesque. Skeltos huffed. It was time. Heart took a shallow breath and walked forward. And when she was far enough that the beasts couldn't see, she finally moved her lips. The fog brushed her skin. The grass swallowed her footsteps. Heart neared the barrier, and, as she had before, as she always did, closed her eyes. She feared she would stop if she could see the houses and the fountains, the plants and flowers. She couldn't keep away the sounds of rushing water and the quiet clucking of chickens, so she pretended they were a dream. They weren't real. It would all be gone in a matter of minutes, and she could do nothing to stop it. Heart drew in a deep breath and squeezed her eyes closed tighter. Tears fell down her cheeks. After this, there was no running. There was no fight. There was no escape. There was only death. "I'm sorry." Heart's mouth opened. Her jaw unhinged. The fog swirled impatiently over her skin. She opened her eyes and screamed. It tore through her, rushed over the stone fence, split the town in two. The once gentle breeze grew violent, throwing her hair over her shoulders. Strands whipped the backs of her arms and the sides of her face. The fog rolled forward, away from Heart and into the streets. Scattered cries came from every part of the town. Her body lurched, jerking her spine from one side to the other. People stumbled out of their houses with their hands over their ears, pouring into the small street. Their tear-stained faces and desperate sobs were all too familiar. This was why Skeltos and Masmus needed her. They needed their victims disarmed before they went in for the kill. The street was flooded in a matter of seconds. The people looked around and waved at the fog, trying to dispel it, searching for the source of the screeching, searching for Heart. A woman near the fence turned. Heart's eyes fell to the child clutched to her chest. The children were the most grim part. But dying here was better than staying alive as an Odalisk. That was a truth Heart had learned long ago. When the woman saw Heart, her dark eyes widened. The color fell from her face. She lifted a trembling hand to the back of her child's head and screamed. Wind rushed over Hart as the beasts ran past her, toward the town. Skeltos spun his mason chain. Masmus lifted his iron club. She tried to look away but found herself frozen. Her scream slashed through her mouth, sharp and violent and panicked. In one blink, blood painted the town. The homes turned to crumbling stones bestrewed with innards and fat. Hart screamed louder, but she still couldn't drown out the cracking of bones, the wailing of weapons crashing through rock, the gurgling pleas of those drowning in their own blood. Her whole body recoiled from the scene, but she couldn't pull her eyes from the gore. Limbs falling, bones cracking, blood washing the stones. Hart wanted to sob. She helped them do this. She was a murderer. She was the thing people feared. The good, courageous Hart that she wanted to be was nothing but a dream. No matter how hard she tried, this would forever be her life. It would forever end the same, with death, destruction, and her return to obedience and silence. She would never be more than the heartsick maiden. She had been a fool to ever think otherwise. So there it is, the first chapter of Burnish. That is where we meet Hart, my favorite little banshee. She is an amazing character, and if you want to see more of her in action, you can go get Burnish right here at this link. Don't forget to check out that Patreon and do all the YouTube things. It really does mean the world to me, helps me out so much, and I will see you guys in the next one. Happy trails!